Please take your seats. We're about to start in a few minutes. Thank you. Our first speaker is an Israeli historian. He has written several books about the Palestinian issue, notably The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which is arguably the most concise and detailed book about the Zionist plan, very detailed plan to ethnically cleanse the indigenous population. He taught at the University of Haifa, and he's the director of the Institute for Palestinian Studies at Exeter. Please help me welcome Ilan Pappe.
Yes, I will use this one. Okay. Guten Morgen, Sabah al-Khair, Boker Tov. This is it. That's 3 languages I know. I'm very, very happy to be here and to see you all. Any occasion that celebrates the idea of one democratic state is an exciting moment and is an encouraging moment and a very hopeful one. And I know this is not the first conference, and I'm sure it will not be the last. We are gathering momentum on the ground, around the world, and I think many more people than ever before are speaking about the one democratic state as the only viable solution for the conflict in Israel and Palestine. So this is a very important juncture, I think, in history, where we are right now with the collapse of, the obvious collapse of the two states solution being acknowledged as a fact by the powers that be and not just by activists on the margin. I was asked to talk about the history of the one democratic state. Well, there's no history of one democratic state. There's a future of one democratic state. So I cannot talk about a history of something that has not yet materialized. But I think I understand what the organizers meant when they said, would you speak about the history of the one democratic state? It was actually speaking about the history of Palestine, or an analysis of the history of Palestine, in a way that clarifies the importance of pushing forward a one democratic state as a vision for the future. And my colleague, Dr. Rada Karmi, would speak more about the future, so I have the easy job. I know what has already happened. She will have to tell you what is going to happen, and she will be accountable for that. I think that the most important feature of the historical analysis that I would like to bring to the fore for an understanding why the prognosis, why the solution of a one democratic state is the only viable one, has to do with the way that we understand the Zionist project, its policies, its strategies, its activities, since the late 19th century until today. Because what I think many of us share in this hall is an understanding that the paradigm of the two-state solution is not only a bad solution, is not only a solution that has not materialized, namely it was not the right response to an ongoing conflict, it was also a huge waste of time and energy. Human beings have limited capacities in terms of energy, thinking, inventing, building structures, and so many good people inside Israel and Palestine and outside of Israel and Palestine were entangled and engaged in a nonsensical project. And we lost time. And when you lose time, on the ground, destruction continues, occupation continues, colonization continues. So I think the historical analysis is important not for the sake of intellectual curiosity, but for the sake of understanding how wasted was the effort. How much did we, as the Jewish joke has it, how much time we wasted looking for the key, not where we lost it, but where there was light. And it's time to go back to where the key was lost, even if it is in relative darkness, that we will grope in our efforts to find it. And what we were disregarding, and I'm not talking about ourselves here, but what the genuine or cynical effort to find a solution for the Israel-Palestine issue was losing was an unwillingness in many ways to face the real nature of the Zionist project. If you look at the peace process ever since 1967, but even before that, during the last days of the British Mandate, you can see an intentional attempt not to analyze Zionism for what it is. And the moment Zionism is taken out of the equation, the real nature of the Zionist movement, its real aspirations and visions, anything that is called a peace process becomes empty of any real content. And if you look at the United Nations Peace Resolution, as it was called then, Resolution 181 from the 29th of November 1947, if you look at the various peace proposals between, there were not that many, but if you look at all these peace proposals between 1948 to 1967, and definitely when the peace process becomes more structured under American guidance after the June 67 war, you can see that Zionism, the nature of Zionism, is not at all on the table. And once you take this element out of an attempt to solve the problem, you get that hollow, insignificant attempt that leads nowhere, as Noam Chomsky rightly said, but is also not meant to lead anywhere. It is what we call the peace process or the diplomatic effort, especially since 1967, is meant to serve certain interests, but it's definitely not a genuine attempt to reconcile the two conflicting parties on the ground. And the best way, as I see it, to describe the nature of Zionism, that basic element that was missing from the peace process, is to look at Zionism, and I'm sure I'm not saying anything new for most of you, as a colonialist project. And nowadays, with the refinement of the research on colonialism, we have even a more accurate definition for Zionism, which is settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is different from usual colonialist project by the fact that the colonialists settled in someone else's homeland in order to reinvent themselves as a new people. So they have to get rid of the indigenous native people, appropriate their history, their identity. They have to wipe out the locals from that history as well as from that country in order to be able to build themselves as something new, of course, something better in their eyes. This was not only done by the Jews who came to Palestine in the late 19th century, it was done by white settlers in North America, in South America, in Australia, in New Zealand, and South Africa. So settler colonialism, this idea that I leave Europe behind in order to rebuild myself to reinvent myself, is not unique to Zionism, but because it was never acknowledged in the case of the so-called peace process, the real nature of the Zionist movement was lost. And you cannot solve the question of Palestine if you don't recognize that Zionism is a settler colonialist phenomenon with one big difference from all the other case studies I've mentioned. It still continues until today. In a way, fortunately, if one can use it that way, because the local people were not genocided, as were the Native Americans, the Aboriginals, and the Maoris, and the Indians in Latin or South America. Therefore, the issue developed into an issue of sovereignty and ownership of the homeland, not just a matter of survival. And in this respect, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement is a success story, even if it did not liberate 1 square inch of Palestine, is the fact that it was there and defeating the settler colonialist basic dream, which is to empty the country from its native population in order to rebuild yourself as a new nation. But in historical terms, settler colonialism is the same, whether in Australia, New Zealand, North America, or Palestine. Now, settler colonialist movements that are not engaged directly in genocide are engaged in another crime against humanity. We all know that genociding a people is a crime against humanity. The Zionist movement was engaged in a different kind or a different crime against humanity in order to fulfill its ambition as a settler colonialist movement. And that is the ethnic cleansing of the native people. So the source of violence, the source of conflict, the reason why we are still talking about Palestine as an unresolved issue, the main reason is that settler colonialist movements either have to get rid physically of the people whose land they have coveted by exterminating them or by expelling them. We don't have historical case studies where the people were left alone or that the settler colonialists went back home recognizing that this is someone else's homeland. Zionism is a huge project, therefore not only of settler colonialism, but of ethnic cleansing. And there are some basic truths about ethnic cleansing that have to be acknowledged if we want to provide an accurate analysis of what we are facing and why is the one democratic state the only way of stopping the ethnic cleansing. The one basic truth about ethnic cleansing is that it does not stop by itself. It does not peter out because the people who are executing the ethnic cleansing suddenly say to themselves, oh, I don't want to complete the project, or I have second thoughts about it, or morally I find it repugnant and therefore I would not continue with dispossessing the people of Palestine. Ethnic cleansing would not stop by itself. There are only two ways in which historically ethnic cleansing has ended. Either by the successful implementation of the ethnic cleansing operation, that is, when the ethnic cleansing is completed, or if someone stopped it by force. Ethnic cleansing does not end out of an internal second thoughts or regret. The second basic truth about ethnic cleansing is that if you are talking about a process, as we do in Israel and Palestine, namely not about just one particular moment in history, such as the Nakba in 1948, if you talk about an ethnic cleansing which stretches over 100 years, which is the case of Palestine, and is not yet completed, in the eyes of those who envisage the future of Palestine as a country cleansed of its native people, it means that everybody in the ethnic cleansing society is involved in it, directly or indirectly. The Israeli society, ever since 1948, the Israeli Jewish society, and before that the Zionist movement, has many people who are directly or indirectly engaged with the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian people, the Palestinian society. It can be an engagement on the highest strategic level by politicians and military people, but it can be a low-level engagement by the judge, the tax collector, the policeman, the teacher, or the immigrant officer in Ben Gurion Airport. And these people are part of the ethnic cleansing operation, even if they are not daily expelling people or exterminating them. Their ethnic cleansing becomes the DNA of the Israeli Jewish society. This is what we are facing. We are facing a society that part of its collective identity, part of its collective perception of the reality is that ethnically cleansing, getting rid of the local people, is morally legitimate, politically desirable, and strategically feasible. That you can do these things. And people, of course, are not conscious all the time that this is what they are doing. When a judge in Haifa sits and he knows that he will give a Palestinian citizen double the punishment he would have given a Jewish citizen for the same offense, he does not think, oh, I'm completing my role in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. But he knows what to do, even if he doesn't have directive from the Minister of Justice to discriminate in such a way. It becomes part of your DNA because the formula that develops ever since the arrival of the first Zionists into Palestine is that if you want a better future, maybe the present is quite good, but if you want a better future, a state that is empty of its Palestinians, or where the Palestinians are invisible, you don't have to think about them because you don't see them, is the ideal type state that you are looking for. And in this respect, Zionists on the left and Zionists in the center and Zionists of the right were not different. They were different in arguing about what is the best tactic to implement this, but not about the vision of Zionism taking over as much of Palestine as possible and having in it as few Palestinians as possible. The third fact about ethnic cleansing, and that is very important, is that, of course, with the years, the small group of Jewish settlers become a political outfit. They become a state. A state is a huge organism. I don't know how many of you created a state in their life, but neither did I. But what I understand is that when you create a state, you create a huge organism. You create something very viable, in a way, very vibrant. And a state, the way a state engages with ethnic cleansing is very different from the way a political movement engages with ethnic cleansing before 1948. A state has to be, or a leadership of a state, the political elite of a state has to be far more pragmatic and practical than a group of a gang, a paramilitary gang, as was the Jewish army, if you want, or the Zionist army in 1948. The Zionist forces in 1948 were not a proper military force. And that's one of the reasons the ethnic cleansing was not completed in 1948, thank God. I mean, if there were an established military force, I doubted whether we would have had today Palestinians in the Galilee. One of the reasons it was possible to stop them a bit, and one of the reasons they were not that effective was that it was not a proper army. We have to remember that. But of course, Israel develops a proper army. It develops a proper military and security apparatuses after 1948. But it also searches for international legitimacy. So it becomes a proper actor in the international arena. And what you could have done as a gang, as a paramilitary gang, as a colonialist movement before the Second World War, you couldn't do easily after the Second World War, or as so-called legitimate state in the international arena. And that's the third feature of ethnic cleansing. It is flexible enough as a strategy, as a vision, as an ideology to adapt itself to different circumstances in history. And the circumstances for Israel after 1948 were very different from the ones before 1948, and those after 1967, again, demanded adapting the ethnic cleansing to yet another change in the geopolitical reality of Palestine. And what the Israeli political leadership and military strategic leadership found out was that sometimes ethnic cleansing can be achieved not by expelling people, because expulsion is a very drastic act of depopulation that you can do in the historical circumstances of 1948, for instance, but you cannot do in 1967. And I will come back to 1967 in a moment. But you cannot always repeat the massive expulsion that you've implemented in 1948. So if you cannot expel people, the other side of the coin of ethnic cleansing is not to allow them to move, not to allow them to expand, to enclave them, to jail them. The Zionist strategy was very clear. Where I can expel people in order to implement my vision of having as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians as possible, where I can expel, I expel. This is the best, to get the people out of the space that I regard as my own. But where I cannot expel, the second best is to limit their movement, to limit their expansion. And we can see these policies very clearly from 1948 onwards, when the Zionist movement becomes a powerful state, powerful enough to force people not to move, but not powerful enough, because of its legitimacy, to execute massive ethnic cleansing as it did in 1948. So the Palestinians who are left inside Israel are subjected to military rule until 1966. The main feature of military rule is the prohibition of free movement. You're not allowed to move freely outside your village, outside your neighborhood. You are invisible as far as the Jewish majority is concerned, and therefore, for all intents and purposes, you were expelled from their vision, from their reality. So there's a good feeling, which was always worrying for the Zionist movement, that the Jews who immigrated to Palestine would not feel that this is an alien country, because there's so many Arabs around. You do all other, by the way, the Israeli government was intentionally involved in other kinds of policies to make sure, and it was very important, especially for the Jews who came from Europe. They were less concerned about what to do with the Jews who came from Arab countries. But the Jews who came from Europe were, in the eyes of the Zionist leadership, the key for success. They had very low views, as we know, and we all written about it. They thought that the Jews who came from the Arab countries were second-category Jews, not very important, not very successful. In fact, Ben-Gurion thought that there was a real danger from within that could defeat the Zionist project. But he agreed to bring them over because he saw that the Jews from the West were not coming. Even the Holocaust survivors preferred the United States and the United Kingdom to Palestine. So that's why eventually the Jews were brought from Iraq, Morocco, Tunisia, and so on. But they were not, the Zionist leadership thought they could easily deal with them because they had this racist view about them, that they are easily manipulated, you can do whatever you want. And in many ways, they were able to do with them what they wanted. They put them in the geographical margins of the Israeli society, in the social margins in the Israeli society, and so on. But the Western European Jews, who many of them were Eastern Europeans, were the ones that you were worried about if you were a Zionist leader. Will they feel that they should stay in Israel instead of going to Switzerland or the United States? And one of the main ways is, first of all, not to let them feel that they are surrounded by Arabs in their own country. And the military regime ensured it Palestinians were not allowed to get out of the Palestinian areas. Another way of doing it was to change the urban space. Ben-Gurion personally supervised the demolition of Arab houses in huge numbers in every city in Israel. Jaffa, Haifa. He wrote in his diary, I think that in every city, if we get rid of 200 to 250 houses that look like Arab houses, the city would look more European. This was, of course, stupid even from a touristic point of view, but he didn't care about aesthetics. Zionism and aesthetics or any care for the beauty of landscape is an oxymoron. So Haifa was de-Arabized. Jaffa was de-Arabized as much as was possible. Jerusalem was de-Arabized. And then they took care about the countryside. If you wanted to convince European Jews to stay, they needed to feel that they were in the middle of Schwarzwald. So they brought tens, thousands of pine trees from Europe and planted them over the ruins of Palestinian villages. And instead of natural Palestinian landscape, those pine trees did not fit, and many of them died later. Not that I care, these pine trees, but maybe some of you are in the Green Party, probably feel bad about the pine trees that died. So I participate in your sorrow. And the idea was to create this kind of European landscape. A particular group that the Zionist leadership was worried about were German Jews, to which I belong. And I remember that one of the first things that the mayor of Haifa, who was himself an Eastern European Jew, in order to convince the German Jews not to leave, because many of them thought maybe after the war they could come back to Germany, was to make sure that at least they will feel that Haifa is in the middle of Germany and not in the middle of Palestine. And they took 2 or 3 canyons in the Carmel Mountains, and they called it Little Switzerland. You can visit these places. If you can see any resemblance to Switzerland, you must have a very developed imagination. But my father did. I remember my father, immediately when he went to one of these wadis, he started speaking in German. So I knew that he thought he was back in Switzerland. And when he saw a little pond that rained, he called it a lake. And when he saw a rat, he called it a squirrel. And of course they spoke German and so on. So part of the ethnic cleansing, coming back to a more serious matter, was changing the urban landscape, the countryside, not allowing you any view of the people themselves as alternative means of ethnic cleansing, because you could not expel people as an established state after 1948. They did try, by the way, to continue the expulsion until 1956. Until 1956, 36 villages were expelled from Israel. But after 1956, especially after the Kfar Qasim massacre, there was a kind of recognition that ethnic cleansing has to be developed in other means. In 1967, of course, the problem became more acute, because Israel's territorial appetite allowed it to exploit the historical junction of 1967 to take over the whole of Palestine. As you know, in 1948, they took over 78% of Palestine. In 1967, the circumstances of 1967 allowed Israel to expand over the whole of historical Palestine. The problem was that with it, you incorporated 1.5 million Palestinians after you got rid of 1 million Palestinians in 1948. And these two elements in ethnic cleansing, in the ethnic cleansing operations of Palestine, are very important in Zionist ideology, the geographical and the demographical. So whenever you have a geographical achievement, namely you take another part of Palestine, you are faced with a demographic problem, because most of Palestine is inhabited, and if you take another part, you also include more Palestinians. And it's very illuminating to read the cabinet meetings, which are now open to the public, immediately after the June 67 war. Half of the government of 1967, the Israeli government of 1967, was made of generals who were taking direct part in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. So naturally, they said to the leadership, let's do in 67 what we did in 1948. What's the big problem? Let's get rid of the Palestinians of the West Bank, throw them out to Jordan, throw out the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip to Egypt, and we will have the whole of Palestine with very small number of Palestinians in it. And this was seriously considered in 1967. However, the more pragmatic and older, one should say, politicians said it won't be that easy as it was in 48. First of all, there was television. They were aware of the power of television in 67, which wasn't there in 1948. They were also not sure whether you can expel twice people. I mean, because they knew that quite a lot of people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were refugees. And they were not sure that after the war, when there's no fighting at all, you can convince soldiers to be involved in such massive expulsion. So they went back to Plan B, which I described before. And the first thing they did was to transfer the military regime, which they imposed on the Palestinians inside Israel and imposed it on the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They still retained alternative means of ethnic cleansing inside Israel after 1967. Not one Palestinian village was allowed to be built. Not one Palestinian neighborhood was allowed to be constructed. None of the Palestinian areas was allowed to expand in any way, and all kinds of glass ceilings, kind of an Israeli version of apartheid, developed inside the Green Line that ensured that the Palestinians, despite their presence, are not there in a way that threatens the Jewish majority. As for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, as you know, the Israelis developed this idea that you can keep people incarcerated in jail, actually in a mega prison of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, without rights, without citizenship, and you can claim to the world that this is a temporary means pending a solution, where you very well known that solution is not coming, and you have a solution. You have a solution. People are either expelled if in your eyes they are too much to swallow, and Palestinians were expelled ever since 1967, as we know, sometimes one person a day, sometimes a whole group of people, and sometimes a whole refugee camp, like those near to Jericho. But in most of the time, you don't need to expel in order to continue the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. You impose military rule, you don't allow people to move, you fragment the space into mini cantons and mini cantons, you don't allow any connection. I don't have to tell you, I'm sure many of you have been to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and have seen for themselves the visible, tangible reality of ethnic cleansing in other means. Now, I think, towards the end of my talk, I think something has changed in the Israeli capacity to continue with this ethnic cleansing operation. I think something has broken down in the machine, thank God, which is a reason for optimism. It really is a reason for optimism, because if you look at the last 66 years, even if you look at the last 100 years since the Zionization of Palestine, one thing that catches your eyes is the ability of Israel to commit these crimes within or under the umbrella of a racist ideology with total immunity as far as the international community is concerned. This is something that, of course, we realize. Israel could not have committed what it had committed, whether it was a massive ethnic cleansing in 1948 or a more sophisticated ethnic cleansing after 1948, with all its criminal structures, if the international community would have not allowed it to do it. So this is something that was always a source for pessimism. Not the fact that Israel was doing it. Analyzing why the Zionist movement was doing it was easy. Explaining why the world allows it to continue for so many years was far more difficult, especially for activists who wanted to change the reality on the ground. But I think something is changing. And what is changing, I think, is an Israeli internal process which was inevitable. If you deal for so many years with ethnic cleansing as a sophisticated strategy, not as an explicit strategy, then you are involved in cheating to yourself, to the world, and you are wasting energies, if you want, to try and hide what you are doing. Another word for this is called labor Zionism, or liberal Zionism, or central Zionism, call it what you want. Israel was marketing itself as something which it wasn't, with the hope, and this worked for a while, that this can give it an umbrella to continue the ethnic cleansing. Because for Israeli strategists, without the completion of the ethnic cleansing, Zionism has not reached its successful moment in time. Now, this was working for a while, but it started to be exposed as impossible because of the internet, because of the Palestinian strategy, because of a change in public opinion. I don't have time to go into it, and I'm sure we have time afterwards to go into it. But in 2000, more or less, Israel as a society, as a political elite, has reached a juncture which I think its founders hoped it will never reach. And that juncture said, now you cannot continue with sophisticated ethnic cleansing, one which is internationally legitimized. Now you have two options. Either you go back to rough ethnic cleansing, brutal ethnic cleansing that is very easily exposed and very quickly gets very angry international response, as we have seen in Gaza in 2009 and so on. So you delegitimize yourself by your own actions. You can shout until tomorrow that you are being delegitimized because there's a rise of new anti-Semitism, but you know yourself that you are being delegitimized because you are now exposed for what you are when it comes to Palestine and the Palestinians, or, of course, decide to be a democratic state and give up ethnic cleansing as an ideology of survival, as your DNA, as your hallmark, as an identity. For the time being, with this I'm striving to end my contribution. For the time being, all the indicators, whether there are elections, public opinion surveys, Israeli official discourse, actions on the ground, all the indicators show that Israeli Jewish society and its leadership decided to opt for the brutal ethnic cleansing and not for a democracy, which is bad news and good news. It's bad news when you are at the receiving end of this brutal policy. It's good news for those of us who were trying to explain to the world what Israel and Zionism is all about. That becomes an open book now. As I said to my sophisticated friends, you don't need to use Michel Foucault anymore to explain Israel. You can just go and visit. You can get rid all these poor MA and PhD students who have read all these terrible and difficult theoretical books in order to explain the reality in Palestine. Good news, you can go directly to the reality of Palestine. There's no need to use this sophisticated methodology. It's good news also because hopefully when things will be so clear, the way of galvanizing people in a massive way would be open for us. And finally, if this is indeed the issue, namely that we are facing what I call a neo-Zionist Israel, an Israel that goes back in many ways to 1948, which will use all its brutal force and would give up much of the sophistication and all kinds of evasive tactics it was using for completing the ethnic cleansing. The two-state solution looks like a totally irrelevant paradigm vis-a-vis a brutal ethnic cleansing. It looked very serious and it looked very feasible when Israel was doing what I call sophisticated ethnic cleansing. You could think that maybe there's someone to talk to on the Israeli side. You would think that maybe you can limit the ethnic cleansing to parts of Palestine. And that created the connection between the two-state solution, the peace process, and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Now that the ethnic cleansing is naked, is transparent, is in front of our eyes, the only way of stopping it is by offering the one democratic state of Israel and Palestine, or of Palestine. And I think that most people who are engaged officially and informally with the issue of Palestine, whether they live there or they were expelled from there or are interested in there, know that this is the naked truth. The question is, would they be courageous enough to face Zionism as a racist ideology, to face Israel as an apartheid state, and to call the Israeli actions since 1948 until today as actions of ethnic cleansing, and remind ourselves that ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity which the international community should not tolerate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilan.